attention to the work being done by newly minted PhDs and THDs. They offer us a glimpse of the new horizons of research, the important questions being asked, and the creative, interdisciplinary approaches that will move us all forward. Here at the Curran Center, we take a hemispheric approach. That is, we hold the conviction that American Catholic studies must include all of the Americas. And at this particular time, it must make a commitment to seek out and amplify those voices, helping us to understand historically underrepresented and minoritized Catholics. For example, last year's inaugural award essay, Dr. Tuan Huang's essay was entitled Ultramontanism, Nationalism, and the Fall of Saigon, Historicizing the Vietnamese American Catholic Experience. Thus, through this award, we look for scholars who are making groundbreaking contributions to the study of Catholics and Catholicism in the Americas. They do it through disciplined and innovative use of sources, as we'll see tonight, through creative and well-grounded arguments that advance a wide range of scholarly conversations, and through substantive connections to broader humanistic concerns, encouraging partnerships and dialogue among those rooted in history, art, anthropology, literature, theology, and other related fields. Ultimately, we are committed to Catholic studies as an intellectual, critical, and engaged enterprise. And we're excited to highlight that scholarship that exemplifies this approach. So let me thank you once again for participating in this webinar. I'll now turn things over to Dr. John Seitz, Associate Director of the Curran Center at Lincoln Center, who will introduce our speaker and her fascinating essay, Regulations for Our Black People, Reconstructing the Experiences of Enslaved People in the United States through Jesuit Records. John?
Yeah, hello everyone. Yes, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you so much, Kelly, for being here. It's my honor to have the opportunity to introduce you to our audience. Kelly Schmidt, our speaker today, received her PhD in public history and US history from Loyola University, Chicago in 2021. She has served as the research coordinator for the Jesuits' Slavery, History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project. In addition, she's done some fascinating work in the area of public history, including teaching high school teachers about colonial Williamsburg, as well as a stint researching and portraying a 19th century abolitionist at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. We'll have to see if we can convince her to reprise her role during the webinar today, or maybe when we finally meet in person. I'm grateful that Kelly has agreed to offer this webinar today, since it touches on issues that face many institutions of higher learning in this country, and in particular, those affiliated with Catholic religious orders like the Jesuits. If there's going to be such a thing as meaningful reparations for enslavement, it will not happen without work like Kelly's. Schmidt's talk today emerges from the prize-winning essay, which was an exploration of the experiences of people enslaved by Jesuits in the 19th century. As I think our conversation today will make clear, Schmidt is a generous and careful scholar, with a keen and creative approach to archival research. The committee that awarded the prize was simply blown away by the scholarly rigor, creativity, and frankly, the moral value of her contribution. I've had the pleasure of teaching Kelly's work in my class on American religions this semester, and I can say that she has accomplished something really remarkable, inspiring students in a core required course to get excited about something as arcane as archives. I will now turn the mic over to Kelly, who will speak for about 50 minutes or so, also inviting you to chime in at various points along the way. In addition to a Q&A period that will happen after the end of the formal presentation, we invite you to submit questions in the chat along the way at any time that they occur to you. And I will find a way, or Kelly will find a way to bring those into the conversation later during the Q&A. So Dr. Schmidt, Thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, John, for your kind words. And thanks to you and Michael and Maria and your team at the Curran Center and Fordham for hosting me today. I'm here today to share with you my process of uncovering lost narratives of people enslaved within the Catholic Church, and particularly in this instance to the Jesuits. And as John said, there will be a few opportunities for audience participation as I invite you to consider what you see in some of the records I share. So I wanted to give you some advance notice so you can prepare to share your answers in the chat. So with that, we'll get started and I'll share my screen here. Okay. When I began researching the lives of people held in slavery by the Jesuits of the central and southern United States, I was told I wouldn't find much. The Jesuits held only about 6 or 7 people in slavery in this region, people told me, and they were too poor to own many others. And the records will be too sparse to know much more than their first names. The structure of record keeping at the Jesuit Archives and Research Center in St. Louis, Missouri reflected those remarks. Oops, sorry. There are only 2 thin folders labeled Slaves and Slavery, one for the St. Stanislaus Seminary and Farm in rural Florissant, Missouri near Ferguson, and the other for St. Louis University, the Jesuit-run college which the province ran. In the St. Stanislaus folder were 3 tax forms listing the number and value of people the Jesuits owned, a receipt recording the hired out labor of an enslaved man named Isaac, and a calculation by a Jesuit of the labor time gained by increasing bondspeople's workday. The St. Louis University slavery folder contains only 2 items that actually pertain to slavery: bills of sale for Mary, whom the Jesuits of St. Louis University purchased in 1850, and Margaret, whom they purchased in 1862. But over the course of my research, I discovered hundreds, if not thousands, of records about the people the Jesuits owned, which disclosed that the Jesuits held not 6 people in slavery beyond Maryland, but more than 400 people in places such as Missouri, Kentucky, Louisiana, Alabama, Kansas, and Illinois from the 18th through the 19th centuries. I learned not only many full names, I also pieced together family structures and began to be able to weave together fragmentary stories of their lives. In so doing, I learned about the ways people enslaved to the Jesuits approached and resisted their enslavement, regarded and shaped their Catholic faith, and formed community, patterns that shattered prevailing myths about slavery and Catholicism in the United States. Today, I will share about my process of uncovering those stories by moving beyond those 2 thin folders in the archives. We will begin with the knowledge needed to navigate Catholic institutional record keeping to find documentation of enslaved people's lives, in this instance, particularly through Jesuit record keeping. Then I will move into how we read against the archives and the records contained within them to gain a fuller and more accurate understanding of enslaved people's experience, which was so often mediated through the writing and record keeping of their owners. Finally, we will discuss how to look beyond Jesuit archives and beyond emancipation, engaging in alternative historical methodologies to understand enslaved people's experience in ways not documented by their enslavers. In so doing, we comb through and dispel layers of myth-making and collective white memory since the era of slavery. And I hope that such approaches will offer a model for more rediscoveries of enslaved people's experience and breaking down myths about Catholic slaveholding in the future. We'll begin with navigating institutional record keeping. Jesuit records are kept for Jesuit operational purposes and thus are structured in ways convenient to Jesuit governance, finance, and personnel, rather than being arranged around the lives of the people they held in slavery. This is why we don't find a slavery collection in the Jesuit archives or most Catholic archives, and why we may find personnel files and manuscript collections for individual Jesuits, but not for the people they enslaved. Enslaved people were not the priority of Jesuit record keeping, so Jesuit records aren't filed, labeled, or tagged according to their lives or the subject of slavery. Thus, unearthing the experiences of enslaved adults and children requires looking in unexpected places for Jesuit records about slavery. Moreover, slavery was ingrained in every aspect of daily life, and thus it's not possible to separate accounts that document slavery and enslaved people from the records where they were recorded. Documentation of enslaved people exists in Jesuit financial and property records, sacramental records, letters, diaries, memoirs, and annual reports. We look among land deeds and property records to find bills of sale and deeds of emancipation for enslaved people. We explore ledgers documenting the Jesuits' finances to find entries to help us piece together aspects of enslaved people's daily lives. And we look in parish, sacramental, and religious association records to begin to understand bondspeople's faith lives and family structures. To know where to look for records pertaining to enslaved people and to understand their context, we must keep in mind how Jesuit archives and Jesuit administrative units have developed and changed over time. Archives of the Society of Jesus operate in a sense as both corporate and family archives. They house the records of a corporate body of an order of priests and brothers who live in community and believe in the renunciation of personal property and the ownership of all things in common. The order's founders recognized the need to maintain frequent and consistent communication regulated by regimented record keeping to keep the widespread members of the global society in contact. As Jesuits established missions and provinces across the globe, their systems of record keeping led them to create administrative repositories where they operated. To find bondspeople in Jesuit records, one must understand the types and layers of these records, the purposes for which they were kept at each location, and how they were combined to be sent for approval and dissemination to central leadership in the province and in Rome. Each record had its own formula and purpose. Every Jesuit house, a sampling shown here at the bottom of the screen, was to be financially autonomous, securing local funding and reporting only debts to Rome. Each house kept daily financial accounts, which were distilled and compiled into province account books. An annual report of personnel, finances, and debts often included enumerations or notations of purchases of enslaved people and were forwarded to Rome. Jesuits at each house kept house diaries known as diaria, which served as daily accounts of Jesuit movements, activities, finances, and decisions. In them, one can find recorded incidents in the lives of enslaved people, including births, deaths, and other significant events. In the minister's diary of St. Charles College in Grand Coteau, Louisiana, one can follow the Jesuits' hiring of enslaved people from women religious and local community members and the life events of the Jesuits' bondsman Ignatius Goff, including his marriage, the birth of his children, his punishment for damaging the Jesuits' property, and his imprisonment for suspected involvement in an attempted slave revolt. Daily financial records, house diaries, and sacramental records were typically combined into formulaic annual letters, or literae annui, circulated within and among provinces and sent by houses to provinces and provinces to Rome. Meant to give an overview of the main events of the house, province, assistancy, or society of that year and the Jesuits' ministerial accomplishments, each paragraph served a specific purpose, such as numbering the sacraments, confessions, conversions, and masses held in a given year, or offering obituaries for Jesuits who had died. What Jesuits documented in keeping with their own goals can be revelatory about the lives of enslaved people. In Missouri, annual letters often distinguish between white, Black, and Indigenous people when enumerating their proselytizing achievements. Every 3 years, such accounts were compiled and delivered as the Historia Domus, or house history. Occasionally, notable events in the lives of Jesuits or the local community made it into these documents. Consequently, annual letters and house histories in Missouri have noted such things as the establishment of a chapel for people of color at St. Francis Xavier College Church, or documented considerations of how to respond to the abolition of slavery and employing the 4 families, now free, who remained on the St. Stanislaus property. As records passed through the Jesuit administrative hierarchy, the writers and reviewers of the records created multiple drafts for revision and distribution. And these memoria, as they were called, were passed from local houses to regional provinces to the Curia in Rome. Records often appear in duplicate in more than one repository as a result, and the variations in drafts can be revealing. When the annual letter from St. Stanislaus in 1869 reported the death of formerly enslaved Proteus Hawkins, one version said Proteus went on his journey toward a better life, while another struck the line and instead recorded that he breathed out his spirit into the hands of the Creator. Other iterations of Jesuit documents have even more significant differences in meaning, and thus it matters when searching for information on enslaved lives to look in all the various drafts and copies kept in house, provincial, and Roman repositories for differences in commentary on enslaved people. And this leads us into bridging multiple records. Because Jesuit archives aren't structured around enslaved lives, when we approach the archives looking for a specific document, we're often disappointed. For example, what if we wanted a list of the enslaved people owned by a Jesuit province? Other than bondspeople named in transactions and financial ledgers, there are only 2 existing lists naming the enslaved adults and children the Missouri Jesuits owned at a given time. The first is found in an agreement stating that the Jesuits who founded the Missouri Mission would bring 6 bondspeople with them, which names Tom, Molly, Isaac, Suki, Moses, and Nancy. The second list is in a ledger entry dated 1831, kept by the Missouri Mission's first superior for tracking the mission's early finances and the properties the order had purchased. These 2 sources are certainly neither definitive nor exhaustive, and they also have more to tell us than simply what our first question asked. I invite you to analyze this 1831 document to see what you can surmise from it alone. Is there anything you can discern about the groupings of 26 names in the document? And please share your answers in the chat. Right, so some people are chiming in that they might be family units. Someone said maybe they're families, relatives, couples. You'll notice that there are groupings of 10, 2, 2, 2, and 10. So perhaps these are grouping different families. Others thought that perhaps this was showing where the enslaved people were assigned to labor or the type of labor they were assigned to do. And someone just pointed out the repetition of names is similar to the first names found in Georgetown archival records. We have another person who suggested maybe these are people who were purchased from the same owners. So what can we do to confirm or eliminate our inferences? We have to look to other records. Documents about the founding of the Missouri Mission showed that the Jesuits had forced 3 couples with them, Thomas and Molly, Moses and Nancy, and Isaac and Susan, or Suki. When we find their names on this list, all but Isaac and Suki are grouped together. Moreover, there are 2 Isaacs in the list, making it difficult to determine which one may be Susan's husband. Jesuit letters and memoirs also indicate that between 16 and 20 more people from the families of Proteus and Annie and Jack and Sally were forced from Maryland to Missouri in 1829. Does this tell us any new information about the way people are grouped on the list or make us more certain of any of our inferences? Feel free to share your answers in the chat. Yeah, so Suki is a nickname for Susan. Right, so someone pointed out in the chat, the Jesuits had regulations to keep enslaved couples together if they sold them. This is something we'll return to later in the conversation. But I think what this comment points out is that married couples in most cases are listed together here, except in Isaac and Susan's case. Proteus and Annie and Jack and Sally's names are at the top of each list of 10, which may suggest that they're listed here as heads of family, with the other 8 listed below, possibly as their children or grandchildren, which may suggest that they're heads of family. And this is supported by a comment from a Jesuit memoir that Thomas and Molly were childless, and Moses and Nancy were forced to leave their children behind in Maryland, and thus they are listed without their children. But what remains unclear is why Isaac would be listed separately from his spouse, Suki. Baptismal records from the White Marsh Plantation in Maryland and St. Ferdinand Church in Florissant, Missouri support this theory and also help us to begin to learn surnames. Sorry, 1 second, I clicked on the slide wrong. So here we have a baptism record for Gabriel showing he's the son of Proteus and Annie, and his older sister Mary is the sponsor. So this helps confirm that this is a family union and helps us approximate ages for some of the members of the family. We also have a baptism record for Mary's child Sally, showing the family used the surname Queen. This record shows that Peter was the son of Isaac and Suki. And here we have a baptism record for William, the son of Jack and Sally. So this is beginning to show us that these are indeed family units and are showing us surnames. Many of them are members of the Queen family. Clarity further emerges about the groupings on this list by comparing it to surviving booklets of summer and winter clothing distributions given to each enslaved family. Each page listed the clothing allotted to one family, and here we see Jack's family. The types and sizes of clothing suggest approximate ages for each person, and seeing who was included in each family group and estimating their age based on the clothing they received indicate that the groupings in the 1831 list were by family, with parents at the top, followed by sons and then daughters. We learned from a document regulating Jesuit management of the farm and enslaved people that Jack and Sally's son Notley had been sent to labor at the Jesuit parish in St. Charles, Missouri, and thus was not included among those allocated clothing at St. Stanislaus when the list was created. The discoveries of more baptismal, confirmation, and communion records help us further determine people's ages. Most of the children received their first communion and were confirmed at age 10. So from these records, we can determine that the children named here were listed from eldest to youngest by backdating confirmation dates. This aids us immensely in identifying who Bond's people are when they come up in other records, especially when they share the same name. And through such records, we begin to glimpse enslaved people's family structures and identities. And we also now have a theory for why Isaac may be listed separately from his wife and son. Perhaps he's the eldest son of Proteus and Annie Queen, and thus listed within that family rather than with his own immediate family. And from here, we can compare this list with other records to learn more about each family. Here we have the marriage record for Isaac Hawkins and Susan Queen, who married at the Jesuit plantation in White Marsh, showing that between this record listing him as Hawkins and his sister's emancipation record, that the family may have also used the surname Hawkins in addition to the surname Queen. A petition for freedom from Thomas Brown for him and his wife Molly show his surname. And First Communion records continue to help us estimate when people were born by backdating about 10 years. Additionally, death records that sometimes list a person's approximate age at death also help us determine when they were born. So we now know the surnames of those first 6 Bonds people who were forced to Missouri: Thomas and Molly Brown, Isaac and Susan Queen or Hawkins, and Moses and Nancy Queen. Finding records about enslaved people also becomes more challenging because over time, Jesuit records move between repositories and are reprocessed as the Jesuits have expanded and consolidated their operations. Originally, when the Missouri mission consisted of St. Stanislaus and several churches and missionary outposts, most of the mission's records were stored at the seminary and farm. As an extension of the Maryland mission, some early Missouri records went to Maryland and remain in the Maryland Province archives. As archives separate and merge, it becomes challenging to locate original records without a sense of the historiography of these relocations. In the process of these transfers, records important for understanding enslaved experience have disappeared, such as the diary of Brother Charles Kenny, an overseer of the St. Stanislaus farm, who, according to Jesuit histories, recorded intimate details about some enslaved people's lives. The complexity of how records were housed or located, or by location or province, requires one to look in multiple collections and repositories for the experience of enslavement at a particular site or within a particular region. Because at certain points in their early histories, it was almost impossible to separate Jesuit administration of the Missouri province from that of St. Louis University, especially since they shared the same personnel and frequently transferred enslaved people between the province's seminary and the university, records became intertwined. One can still find province records in the university archives and university records in the province archives. Thus, the first ledger of a volume documenting enslaved people may be within the province archives, while the second is in the university archives. Records about the Jesuit bondpeople exist beyond the enclosures of Jesuit archives in university archives, archdiocesan archives, parish registers, and city, state, and federal records. So in addition to looking in unexpected places within Jesuit archives, the contents of Jesuit archives need to be put in dialogue with other archives holdings to help fill the silences. Though the Jesuits left little description of the individual lives of the bondspeople they owned, by cross-referencing these records and by comparing them with other literature on the lives of enslaved people, we can begin to uncover what their lives in bondage were like. When researching people enslaved to a nuclear family, we often follow the family's records, searching diaries and financial records, looking for bequeathals and bills of sale to follow enslaved people as they were inherited or sold. For the Jesuits who passed ownership of enslaved people from one superior to the next or between Jesuit houses and works, we have to look in Jesuit institutional records and personnel records. While records for Jesuit institutions that are no longer in operation usually get moved to Jesuit province archives, Jesuit institutions that are still running often still retain their own records. So we have to look beyond Jesuit archives into parish, school, or other Jesuit repositories. Let's look at St. Mary's College near Lebanon, Kentucky as an example. Jesuits from the province of Lyon, France, agreed to run the college in about 1831 and remained until 1846 when they left for New York to assume administration over St. John's College, which is now Fordham University, our hosts today. Histories of Fordham claim a direct heritage in St. Mary's College. During their time at St. Mary's, Jesuits sustained the college through enslaved labor. Today, St. Mary's is closed and the former campus operates as a minimum security prison. So with the college's records dispersed from the college, where do we look to learn about the lives of people enslaved on campus? Jesuits at St. Mary's College delivered reports on their operation and their enslaved people to the Lyon province in France and to Rome. When the Jesuits left St. Mary's in 1846 to administer St. John's College, documentation of at least 17 enslaved people they owned went with them, the St. John's College House diary picking up in the same ledger where the St. Mary's diary left off. Moreover, sites in the New Orleans mission operated by French and Missouri Jesuits since the 1830s became the New Orleans province in 1907, resulting in records mentioning enslaved people that were kept in Louisiana, Missouri, France, and Rome. Records from the New Orleans mission that transitioned to the New Orleans province were recently moved into the Jesuit Archives and Research Center. After the Jesuits' departure from St. Mary's, diocesan priests from Indiana and Kentucky and other religious orders took turns running the college, taking further records about enslaved people with them and leading to their storage in diocesan archives and the archives of those orders. Moreover, several records that remained in Kentucky were collected by Francis P. Clark, a microfilmer at the University of Notre Dame, who as a Kentucky native took an interest in collecting records documenting Kentucky's Catholic history and donated them to the university at his death. To attempt to fill in gaps left by the scattering of records from St. Mary's College, we can also turn to city, state, and federal records. Census records for St. Mary's College show the number of people the Jesuits held in slavery in 1840 and their approximate ages. Sacramental records from the nearby church and the Jesuit chapel tell us the names of two, Rachel and Teresa. A published memoir by a Jesuit who had been at St. Mary's also suggests that a man named Basil and his family were sent to the college, but his objective to portray the Jesuits as kindly owners who brought the family in and provided for all their needs so they could practice their Catholic faith casts doubt on the accuracy of the story. Indeed, mythologies prevail in previous histories of slavery in the Catholic Church that Catholic slaveholders were good to their bondspeople, that enslaved people were contented and thus not motivated to challenge their enslavement, and that enslaved people were blindly obedient to their faith and that thus did not form lasting Catholic communities or develop faith-based political agency. Because archives were maintained according to Jesuits' mindsets and not enslaved people's, we have to read against the grain to overcome bias in the perspective in these records. For instance, Jesuit records frequently claim that enslaved people were contented and well cared for. Jesuit records regulating the management of enslaved people stipulate that limitations be placed on the physical punishment of bondspeople and that the separation of enslaved families was prohibited. This is what was referenced earlier by one participant. After Jesuit Peter Kenny was sent from Rome to inspect Jesuit management of their farms, he reminded Missouri Province Jesuits that all ours, priests and non-priests, will understand that it is most strictly forbidden and solemnly forbidden them to inflict any species of corporal chastisement on a female slave, or even to threaten by word or act that they will personally chastise them. Neither are the priests to inflict corporal chastisement on the male servants. Jesuits were forbidden from physically punishing enslaved women, but they could employ lay people to punish them if necessary. Priests were not allowed to beat bondsmen, but brothers and novices could. Though priests were instructed to, quote, as much as possible ever abstain from an act so little convenient to their sacred character, they were still allowed to physically chastise people they described as boys under the age of 21 who needed, quote, slight correction. But when we look beyond enslaved management records to Jesuit letters and diaries that document daily practices, we learn that Jesuits did not adhere to their regulations. Enslaved people, including women, were beaten regularly. One Jesuit brother's letter, housed in the Jesuit archives in Britain, recounts that, on another occasion, I was called to attend the stripping and tying of a Black woman who would not strip herself to be flogged, and Father Van Quickenborn, the superior, again in trousers and flannel shirt, ordered a layman to force her to strip, and in this context, she was so uncovered that her sister who stood by cried out, "My sister is naked." Such accounts also belie the myth that enslaved people were happy and contented, as many Jesuit records claim. Enslaved people fought back against this mistreatment, as when women used the regulation against beating enslaved women to their advantage by throwing themselves in front of their husbands to prevent beatings, as we see in the account on the screen. The scattering of fragmentary records about the life of an enslaved man named Peter Queen hides the violence done to him and his family. Only by looking widely across many archives and repeatedly comparing and revisiting records did I learn that Peter Queen was sold at least 5 times over the course of his life, in contradiction to Jesuit regulations against separating enslaved families. Initially, the only record known about Peter Queen was his bill of sale from when Louis Barada of St. Charles, Missouri, sold him to the Jesuits, a record almost lost to researchers because it was filed, perhaps by mistake, in the middle of a folder of letters between the Jesuits and the U.S. Office of Indian Affairs. From it, we can't even determine his surname. For a long time, I was working from the theory that Peter may have been Pierre, the son of an enslaved woman Felicite and a Spanish man named Antoine, because Louis Barada was his owner in the record, and the dates in the baptism aligned with other Jesuit-created records suggesting Peter's approximate age. Several years later, however, I discovered one vague reference to Peter Queen's purchase in the personnel file of the purchaser, Jesuit Theodore de Thou, that completely overturned who I thought he was. It revealed to me that this 1832 bill of sale did not mark the first time Peter Queen became the property of the Jesuits, but that he was being repurchased by the Jesuits because his parents kept pressuring de Thou to do so. Suddenly, a whole series of piecemeal records I had been trying to understand came together as referring to one major event. From my knowledge of other records that helped me reconstruct the lives of enslaved people, I realized that Peter Queen was the son of either Proteus and Annie Hawkins Queen or Jack and Sally Queen, and was forced with his parents and siblings to Missouri in 1829. Peter, a 17-year-old by 1830, strongly resented his enslavement, likely balking at his and his family's poor living conditions, arduous labor, and the beatings they endured. Around that time, Jesuit Superior Charles Van Quickenborne, de Thou's predecessor, claims that Peter had threatened to kill him, though no other Jesuit had heard the alleged threat. Van Quickenborne subsequently directed that Peter be sold. And this is why we don't find Peter Queen with his family on the Jesuits' 1831 inventory of enslaved people that we looked at earlier. Peter's kin made their anger and mourning known to the Jesuits, refusing to let them forget what they had done. Jesuit Pierre-Jean de Schmidt wrote, "His poor parents constantly lament his loss, and the people are far from being happy and satisfied." Following Peter's sale, enslaved people's displeasure with Van Quickenborne grew so strong that Van Quickenborne did not dare sleep in his own room at night and had the door to his room guarded. Peter's parents never ceased grieving the loss of their son, nor relented in pushing to have him returned to them. For 2 years, they pressured de Thou, who had replaced Van Quickenborne as superior, to buy their son back. De Thou wrote that Peter's parents never stopped asking me to repurchase him. After 2 years of constant insistence, Peter's parents succeeded at convincing de Thou to buy their son back. By this time, Peter was in the possession of Louis Ferrata. With money donated from his mother and other funds, de Thou repurchased Peter in 1832. In addition to the likely misfiled bill of sale, a slip of paper in the financial ledger of St. Stanislaus Seminary at the Jesuit archive shows that part of his purchase price was paid for in alms. The St. Stanislaus financial ledgers tell of Peter's life in terms of his labor on the farm, but details about his family life and the community network he established with other enslaved people are found through the sacramental and sodality records of St. Ferdinand Church. These records are split between 2 locations. Originally, some of the parish records were located at the new St. Ferdinand Church in Florissant, Missouri, and have since been rehoused at the archives of the Archdiocese of St. Louis. The other sacramental records, because the church was for a span of time run by the Jesuits, are located in the Jesuit archives. These sacramental records tell us that while laboring on the Jesuits' farm, Peter met Marion, a woman enslaved to Major Richard Graham, who owned a farm nearby. Peter and Marion married in December 1843 and had 3 children, Elizabeth, Gabriel, and Thomas William. But the family and kin community Peter had rebuilt in Florissant was soon torn apart. Jesuit consultors' minutes at the Jesuit archives tell us that the Jesuits blamed Peter and Marion for being a source of harm to the other enslaved people at the novitiate. What this really meant was probably that the couple was encouraging their fellow bondspeople to resist their enslavement, or that they were behaving in a way the Jesuits deemed disobedient or immoral, and thus, according to the Jesuits, set a bad example. What happened next can be traced through the financial ledgers of St. Stanislaus Seminary and of the Missouri Vice Province, located at the Jesuit archives, and the financial ledgers of the Jesuit-run St. Joseph College in Bardstown, Kentucky. Now closed, the college's records are split between the Jesuit archives, St. Louis University's archives, and the archives of the University of Notre Dame. Within the same year of the birth of Peter and Marion's youngest child, Thomas William, Peter was sold away from his family and kin and made to work at St. Joseph College in Bardstown. Despite Jesuit regulations that prohibited separation of families, they forced Peter to leave his wife and children behind. Peter left a small sum of money for Marion to support herself and their 3 children, the oldest of whom was 3 years old. A few weeks after Peter's forced arrival in Bardstown, he ran away. Looking beyond Jesuit archives into newspapers, we learn that Father Peter Verhagen, former president of St. Louis University and by that time president of St. Joseph College, posted an ad in local papers offering a $50 reward for Peter's, quote, apprehension and safe confinement in the Bardstown jail. Peter was caught, for on November 13, 1849, the same day as the publication of this advertisement, the Jesuit consultors of the Missouri Vice Province questioned in their minutes whether we ought to sell the slave Peter, who ran away and is now spending time in prison in Louisville. All agreed that he should be sold, and Peter was sold, and we do not know if he and his family ever saw one another again. About a month later, the consultors, trying to decide what to do with the revenue from Peter's sale, agreed to use the money to purchase an enslaved woman named Mary Hopkins Queen, who was the widow of Gabriel Hawkins and later married Augustine Queen, both of whom were held in slavery by the Jesuits in Missouri. Jesuits claimed they purchased Mary Hopkins Queen to prevent Mary and Augustine from being torn apart in the future should Mary's owners ever decide to move or sell her. In such a way, Jesuits sought to preserve one family from the proceeds of tearing another apart. Not only do the experiences of enslaved people defy myths of the contented priest-slave, they also challenge historical interpretations that have taken Jesuit conceptions of their benevolence at face value or sought to defend or apologize for the Jesuits, as we see here in Jesuit Felix Verite's attempts to explain away enslaved people's discontent by claiming they were happy to be with the Jesuits to have the means necessary to obtain their salvation. Prioritizing the lives and perspectives of bondspeople over their Jesuit owners enables us to tell their stories with more accuracy and uplift their resiliency and courage. Take, for instance, the life of Peter Hawkins. The passage on the screen comes from Jesuit historian Gilbert Garrigan's 1938 work, Jesuits of the Middle United States. How does Garrigan portray Peter Hawkins in this passage? As I read it, I invite you to share your answers in the chat. Little Peter was destined to be the last survivor of the Negro colony at the farm, lodging at the novitiate up to within a short time of his death, which occurred as late as 1907. In the dark days of the Civil War, he was Brother Kenny's chief aide in working the farm. The brother's diary for September 10, 1862 has an entry that tells its own tale. Rain, nothing a-doing. Hands all scattered on account of the war or sick. Only Peter to work. Peter's honesty was proof against all temptation, and no sum of money was too great to entrust to him for delivery in St. Louis. He was a deeply religious man who knew his imitation of Christ. He was married in January 1863 to a negress named Margaret, purchased by the novitiate at an outlay of $800. So how does this passage portray Peter, and what might it be overlooking? Someone put this in the Q&A. He may be seeking favor in anticipation of marriage. I think someone pointed out here, Peter, this may be overlooking that Peter didn't have any choices in these matters. So this passage portrays, and John pointed out, if you really knew the imitation of Christ, that seems like a deep Catholic education. So he not only just knew the catechism, he knew works that were important to the formation of the Jesuits. And so Peter here is portrayed as pious, obedient, trustworthy, and devoted to the Jesuits. His nickname is belittling, and a lot of this passage about him is rather belittling as well. But Peter's seeming devotion did not dampen his desire for freedom or his motivation to resist the Jesuits. We learn from the consultor's minutes that Peter negotiated an arrangement with the Jesuits to be able to purchase his freedom. Although the Jesuits claimed they bought Margaret as a, quote, reward to Peter for being, quote, the best slave, they did not buy Margaret simply as an act of kindness to Peter, as the previous passage might suggest. Peter petitioned the Jesuits for his intended spouse to be purchased so they would not be separated, and the Jesuits in turn required that Peter pay Margaret's $800 purchase price. For 2 years, Peter and Margaret worked hard to raise the money for their freedom, but the cost was unattainable. Peter returned to the Jesuits demanding to live free, and Jesuits complained in their consultor's minutes that Peter, a Black slave in our novitiate, like almost all the other slaves these days who have gone giddy, wants to leave us and live of his own right. He had promised to repay us the money that we spent to buy his wife 2 years ago. What response then should we give him when the question arises of this repayment, which he will now hardly wish to make? Jesuits blamed other enslaved people for convincing Peter not to be obedient and to stand up to his owners, but Peter's insistence paid off. The Jesuits reduced the payment to $400 and gave Peter and Margaret a choice, either to leave and labor as if free people and pay off the remaining cost over time, or work on the Jesuits' property for 2 more years without compensation and leave free without obligations or debts. Ultimately, Peter and Margaret chose to stay. Less than 1 year into the agreement, Missouri legislators abolished slavery on January 11, 1865. However, the Jesuits held Peter and Margaret in a state of debt slavery as the couple continued to labor uncompensated to pay off the imposed debt for Margaret's purchase. The Jesuits continued to take advantage of Peter and Margaret Hawkins even after they were free. In 1866, Peter requested from the Jesuits a 10-acre plot of farmland on which he could live and work, but the Jesuits denied him, claiming it would be inefficient. Peter did not receive a salary until January 15, 1867, 2 years after the abolition of slavery. He remained at the Jesuits' farm until close to the time of his death, around 1907, a few years after this photo was taken. Gilbert Garrigan knew of and had read these consultors' minutes, but he does not tell the whole story about Peter Hawkins. Imagine the myths we would continue to believe if we took Garrigan's words at face value and looked no further. We would miss the courage Peter Hawkins had and the risks he took to advocate for his freedom. When using archives to understand the lives of individuals not historically deemed worthy of documentation and prevented by methods of oppression from being able to leave many written records of their own, looking beyond the intended scope by extending the time frame, repositories, and record types for review can reveal how enslaved families lived and worked even before they became free. Slave owners' records tend to obscure how enslaved people sought to use what means they had to take care of themselves and their own and make meaning of their lives, but records from and about those whose lives extended beyond the abolition of slavery demonstrate how they exerted agency. Initially, the only known record about the Tyler family were the deeds of emancipation for brothers Thomas, Edward, George Jr., and Samuel Tyler, housed at the Jesuit archives, and a St. Louis University Board of Trustees decision to emancipate them, housed at St. Louis University's archives. The brothers were the sons of George Tyler, a man enslaved to Anthony Miltenberger, and Matilda Tyler, who was enslaved at St. Louis University. What do we infer about the Jesuits' motivations, for instance, or how this emancipation came about when we read the Board of Trustees' decision about the Tyler sons? Feel free to place your answers in the chat. I can read this here. It says, the board having been convened by previous notice, the president laid before the meeting the purpose for which he had assembled it. It was accordingly proposed the Reverend J.S. Verdun and seconded by F.P. O'Loughlin that the 4 slaves belonging to the St. Louis University, namely Edmund, age 27, George, age 25, Thomas, age 23, and Samuel Tyler, aged 18 years, sons of George and Matilda Tyler, be and are hereby declared free, and that the title deeds of their legal manumission be signed by the president and countersigned by the chancellor, and being duly registered in court, then delivered to them. The motion was carried without a dissenting voice. Someone wrote, getting ready for the Civil War. It's January 1859, so sectional tensions are growing. In St. Louis, especially, it's becoming less profitable to own enslaved people directly and more profitable to hire them out or rent them from other slaveholders. So that's one possibility, one motivation for why the Jesuits are emancipating the Tyler family. Any other ideas? So I'm not seeing any, but I've had people in the past read this and read the deeds of emancipation and assume that this was some sort of act of benevolence by the Jesuits, that perhaps they were beginning to be influenced by anti-slavery sentiments. Someone pointed out here, it's becoming more expensive to hold the Tyler sons in slavery than to own them directly. And with just these records, it's hard to tell what's motivating the Jesuits to act. Maybe they're being pressured in other ways. So although one might be able to interpret the trustees' decision as an act of benevolence or goodwill, as some have done in the past, what might be missing? When we compare records across archives and repositories, we learn more. And the discovery of an entry in the Missouri Vice Province's financial records begins to tell us a different story. It states that Matilda Tyler, the son's mother, is to have her freedom if she pay $300 to be appropriated to St. Francis Xavier Church. The transactions which follow document that Matilda made payments in 4 installments from June 1847 to August 1848. So Matilda Tyler raised money to buy her own freedom. That is, the Jesuits required Matilda to pay for her freedom, and you can imagine the negotiations she must have entered into with them. But what about her sons? This record from 1847 to 1848 makes no mention of them, and when we revisit the Board of Trustees' decision, we see it's dated January 1859. So where can we find more? Slaveholders were required to register their emancipations of enslaved people, and newly free people in Missouri were required to pay a $500 freedom bond and obtain a license approving their free status, or they could be returned to slavery. Thus, looking beyond Jesuit-affiliated archives leads us to city and state records, where John Anthony Ellett, S.J., president of the St. Louis University Board of Trustees, registered the emancipation of Matilda Tyler and her 3-year-old son, Charlie. Matilda Tyler was able to free herself and her youngest son in 1848, but it took at least another 10 years until 1859 to raise the money for her 4 eldest sons' freedom. Accounts in Matilda Tyler's name found in financial books of St. Louis University show that the family continued to make payments to the Jesuits well into the 1870s, long after their own emancipation and long after the abolition of slavery in 1865. They also deposited payments in support of the Colored Chapel, as it was called, within St. Francis Xavier College Church, where they worshiped, and where the funds for Matilda Tyler's purchase price were allocated. When we read the Tyler family's lives through their own eyes rather than through the Jesuits, we learn truths that would otherwise go unrecognized. Matilda Tyler and her sons' lives show how they actively pursued freedom and paid for it by their own means, continued making payments to the Jesuits for freedom even after slavery was abolished, and in freedom, as we will see, built community and sought Black equality through politics, education, and the arts. Looking for records beyond the period of enslavement can help us look back to understand how slavery shaped people's lives and the efforts they made to surmount it. One enslaved woman, Henrietta Mills, may have remained unknown had only Jesuit institutional records from the era of slavery been scoured. Only 2 surviving sacramental records document her life in slavery. The first, located in the Archdiocese of St. Louis archives, is her June 1860 marriage record to Charles Chauvin in the registers of St. Francis Xavier College Church, which identifies her as a slave of St. Louis University. Her name appears again while in slavery only in her confirmation record of 1855, also stored in the Archdiocese archives. Another record believed to refer to Henrietta, her possible baptism record, in which the Jesuit baptizer recorded her as Henry, reveals how crucial details in the lives of enslaved people can be lost due to the violent, dehumanizing, fragmentary, and dismissive ways their lives were documented. Using just these few records, we can only surmise what Henrietta Mills Chauvin's life was like. But when we continue to expand where we look for records beyond Jesuit archives and beyond enslavement, we find new things. We find archdiocesan sacramental records for the baptisms of her children and federal census records demonstrating that Henrietta and her husband Charles had 10 children. From federal military records, we learn that Charles Chauvin was drafted as a soldier in the Civil War in November 1864 and advanced through the ranks to become a sergeant, and that Henrietta, in the year of his absence, worked hard to support her 2 young sons, with census records and city directories showing that poverty persistently threatened them. As the family persevered through hardship, they led meaningful lives. After Charles returned from war, he and Henrietta named 2 of their sons, Abraham and Lincoln, presumably in celebration of the freedom they had obtained. When Charles died, Henrietta and her children together strove to support the family. As she applied for Charles's military pension, Henrietta knew where the records proving her relationship to Charles and the ages of her 2 youngest dependent children were kept. She went to the Jesuit pastor of St. Elizabeth Parish, who supplied copies of her marriage record and the baptism records of Jerome and Louis, and testified to their veracity. To support herself and her youngest sons, Henrietta worked as a washer and housekeeper, while her elder daughters and sons took up work as teamsters, housekeepers, waiters, washers, and barbers. Yet their labor alone did not define them. Sylvester Chauvin played third base and right field and was team captain for the St. Louis Blackstockings, the first professional African-American baseball team. The team was co-founded by his relative, Charles H. Tyler, whose mother, Matilda Tyler, had purchased his freedom from the Jesuits when he was 3. Charles had made a name for himself as a businessman and political leader advocating for equality in St. Louis. Music filled the lives of the Chauvin family. Census records, city directors, and an oral history interview show that brothers Sylvester, Abraham, Peter, Lincoln, and Louis Chauvin were musicians. Sylvester played brass instruments, Lincoln guitar, and Louis piano. Louis, the youngest, was baptized in St. Elizabeth Parish in 1884 and performed for the parish as he emerged as one of the era's most famed ragtime musicians. He performed with Scott Joplin and played at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. Louis could not read or write music and never played the same song twice. Thus, Heliotrope Bouquet, which Joplin wrote down, is Chauvin's only surviving composition. If Chauvin had recorded his music, we might remember him more than Joplin today. By piecing together these disparate archival records, we learn about the richness of the Chauvins' lives. Prior to this, ragtime historians have only speculated about Louis's parentage. Some thought his brother Sylvester was his father due to their difference in age and shared musical background and residence. His friend and fellow musician Sam Patterson believed Louis's parents were French Creoles from New Orleans. And other publications have projected that Louis's mother was African American and his father had Spanish and Native American ancestry. Without Henrietta Mills's marriage record from St. Francis Xavier College Church, denoting her as a, quote, slave of St. Louis University, and without Louis's baptismal record from St. Elizabeth Parish naming his parents, we would never know that ragtime musician Louis Chauvin's family had once been held in bondage to a Jesuit university. In addition to gleaning old records in the ways I've described, methodologies such as oral history and digital humanities research help us further probe the extent of what these records can tell us. For example, network analysis software can help us visualize enslaved communities through the family structures and kin found as witnesses and godparents in sacramental records. Together, all of these approaches tell us something previous histories have denied, that enslaved people were not contented, that they resisted their enslavement, and that they shaped their communities and their faith. So why does exploring these new approaches to understanding the lives of people enslaved within the Catholic Church matter? It helps us engage in innovative and path-breaking approaches to understanding historically neglected communities and the impacts they had in their own contexts and on us today. It encourages historical truth-telling that draws us closer to having a more representative collective narrative of our history that includes and values the role enslaved Catholics played in shaping our society and the Catholic Church and its institutions. And it builds empathy and understanding for past and present communities, drawing us closer to having a more just society today. It's my hope that by providing a model for expanding this work, we might build a more complete picture of the ways enslaved Indigenous and African communities and their free descendants shaped the Church. Thank you. So that's all from me. Do we have any questions?
Hello, folks. We will be monitoring the chat, so please feel free to add your questions into the chat room. Thank you so much, Dr. Schmidt. That was really illuminating and layered presentation of your research. I think there was a lot to absorb there, a lot to think about, and you created a really dense portrait of life among enslaved people owned by the Jesuits. So I want to give folks a couple minutes to sort of gather their thoughts, and I will sort of try to help you filter some of these questions into the conversation here. If you see something you want to jump on, please feel free to go ahead and do that yourself as well. I see a question about the digitizing of records, and to what degree records have been digitized or not.
Yeah, so a couple answers to this. You may be aware of the work happening at Georgetown University, the Georgetown Slavery Archive that's curated by Adam Rothman and Elsa Barraza Mendoza, where they're scanning records from Georgetown University's archives and from elsewhere and putting them online so that people can have access to them. And until recently, I was the research coordinator for the Slavery History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project, which is an initiative of the Jesuits of Canada and the United States and St. Louis University. And in that work, we were working to scan all the records in the Jesuit archives so that they could be put online in an online archive and build partnerships with other archives and institutions that help complete the story of enslaved people's experience so that this can all be available to scholars, stakeholders, and descendants. That work's still ongoing, but it's going to take a number of years for that archive to be live.
Thank you for that. I see another question here about, it says, the histories reconstructed reveal a painstaking process. Is there a network of scholars at Jesuit institutions undertaking this work collectively, sharing resources, connecting across archives, et cetera?
Yeah, so within the umbrella of the Slavery History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project, that network was beginning to take shape. We often worked in partnership with Georgetown University, with Xavier University in Cincinnati, the College of the Holy Cross, and Boston College. And we're trying to bring others into the conversation, such as Spring Hill College in Alabama. And we had a lot of Jesuit high schools that were partnering with us too. So many of the high schools grew out of Jesuit colleges and thus share this history of slaveholding and actually have archives themselves. So we were inviting students to learn the methodologies to engage in this work and comb through their own school's archives to do so.
Mm-hmm. I had a question. I'll just insert my own prerogative here. I guess I'm wondering if you saw any conflicts in Jesuit documentation among the Jesuits themselves about slave trade, right? Which I think if I'm not mistaken, 1839, there's a papal document that tries to extricate Catholics from the trading, the marketplace of enslaved peoples. Were there conflicts or debates that are present in the archives that indicate that Jesuits were wondering about this? Because what you show in your documentation here is that they were in fact participating in the trade of slaves, not just the ownership of enslaved people, but the trading or sale and purchasing of enslaved people. So I'm wondering if you saw any record of, the impact of that 1839 papal encyclical, or if that just sort of didn't register at this level.
Mm-hmm. So even though that encyclical discouraged Catholics from participating in the slave trade, most Catholics in the US just completely ignored it. But we do see Jesuit debates occurring building up to the sale of more than 300 people from Georgetown in the Maryland province in 1838, where a lot of older Jesuits felt that there was an obligation to keep enslaved people on the Jesuit farms to continue ministering to them, and younger Jesuits who were more interested in abandoning the plantations and moving into the city to minister to Catholic immigrant populations. And you began to see this debate on whether the sale was moral, primarily for reasons of abandoning instructing enslaved people in the Catholic faith, and they felt like they were abandoning that moral obligation. But on the whole, most Jesuits didn't question it, and most Jesuits would not have called themselves abolitionists. There were only a handful of Jesuits who were against slavery, and even they wouldn't have jumped on board to the abolitionist cause.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, I see some additional questions here. Hard to listen to some of that. Any plans to memorialize the children of the couples? And there's another question that's related to that. Sort of, where are these families that you highlighted today?
Mm-hmm. So the people who were enslaved in the Maryland province have known about their history for a lot longer than, in some cases, people enslaved to the Jesuits who descend from people enslaved to the Jesuits in other parts of the country. So descendants of people whose ancestors were enslaved to the Jesuits in Maryland have organized and have been working with the Jesuits to discuss what reconciliation, reparation, memorialization look like. And through SHMR, we were working to expand that work to include the descendants of all communities who were enslaved to the Jesuits in the United States. So we were in the process of doing genealogy to connect with living descendants and to bring them, if they wanted, into conversation about how we would memorialize their ancestors, for example, on SLU's campus or at other sites, and how we would teach this history publicly and within Jesuit institutions.
Yes, a couple people are asking about that effort, Jesuit reconciliation efforts on a global scale. Someone asked that question. Are there partnerships there across different provinces of the Jesuits around the world?
I'm not aware of partnerships that exist on a global scale, but I know of work being done in different areas. I know there's a lot of research and archaeology being done on enslaved communities in South America. And I've been in communication with archivists from different Jesuit archives in Britain, Ireland, France, who are enthusiastic about the work and want to know how they can contribute to doing more.
Mm-hmm. I see an interesting question here, which you might be able to elaborate on a little bit. There's a question about sort of, in what ways were these enslaved peoples Catholic? And that's something that my students are also wondering about. What can you discern from the records? I know you have sacramental records from the times after enslavement, indicating that maybe they wanted to participate in the Catholic traditions in some way. But what else can you learn about their Catholicism from these records?
So this is something I explore more deeply in another article, and it's hard to determine with any certainty how enslaved people approach their faith with such little documentation, but with some of these alternative methodologies, we can begin to infer more. What I've been seeing is that many people weren't Catholic when they became enslaved to the Jesuits, especially in Maryland during the colonial period in the 18th century. And over time, they converted to Catholicism. It's hard to determine how willingly they did so, but as they and generations of their descendants practiced Catholicism, by the time people were enslaved in Missouri and Kentucky and elsewhere who had been forced from Maryland, most of those families had been Catholic for generations and appear to have been very sincere in their faith, such as when we saw Peter Hawkins being really familiar with the imitation of Christ. When Thomas Brown petitioned for his freedom, he used religious language to do so. If you recall that network that I showed at the end of the presentation, that's a community network built out of sacramental records. And we begin to see through looking at that network that there were certain people within the enslaved community who were chosen over and over and over and over and over again to be godparents or witnesses at marriages, which shows that they might have been revered in particular for being strong in their faith, or being an example to others within the community, or a matriarch or patriarch in the community. And I think the most important thing we see is that after slavery, these formerly enslaved communities pushed really hard to have their own spaces of worship separate from white Catholics, where they could worship free from discrimination and have more influence over how they practice their faith. And that's the biggest sign to me that Catholicism was really important within these enslaved communities.
Do you know what happened to the enslaved people whose records went with the Jesuits who came to St. John's College in New York? Do you have records of what happened to those, I think it was maybe 17 individuals who were owned by that community and helped them run that college in Kentucky before they came to run the college and basically save Fordham, save St. John's College from financial ruin by showing up and taking over?
So I don't know yet. That was something I was trying to research when the pandemic hit in 2020, and I haven't been able to find all the answers because some of those answers are at Fordham, some of those answers are in France, some of them are in Rome, and I haven't been able to look at all the records. But at St. Joseph's College in Bardstown, Kentucky, and other places where the Jesuits came and went, sometimes when one religious group left a college and another took over, they just passed on their enslaved people to the next religious group running the college, and they remained at the college. So that's one possibility of what could have happened. Another possibility is that the families or the people enslaved at the college may have been sold away when the Jesuits left. Those records at Fordham are in Latin and French, so there's been some people in those departments at Fordham who have been combing through those records for me and beginning to find some entries about enslaved people. So hopefully we'll all know a little bit more in the future.
Yeah, that's obviously something very on the surface for us here, and the question that relates to that comes from Julie here. How do you think Jesuit institutions can best memorialize the enslaved people? She says, I'm thinking about naming opportunities, etc. And how do you think we can best educate our young people about this while not piling on the religion is bad feeling that so many young people have? Maybe an emphasis on the reconciliation part. So how do you respond to those concerns and questions? It's also related here, a question about high school curriculums, that's another piece.
Yeah, those are big questions, and I don't know if I can answer them in complete depth here, but I can give some basic answers. In my work with the Slavery History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project, we really wanted to privilege the voices of descendant communities. So as we engage in memorialization, we wanted to listen and learn from descendants about how they wanted their ancestors memorialized, and go from there. The problem is we'll never know every single living descendant of people enslaved to the Jesuits. And there will be many voices at the table, and we're going to have to make some decisions. So I don't want to speak for what that memorialization should look like, but I know different campuses are renaming buildings. Some are putting up statues honoring enslaved people, creating reflective memorial gardens, creating plaques naming enslaved people on their campus. Other ways we can remember enslaved people is by telling their stories, posting them publicly online so people can read them, teaching them in our schools, making it an ingrained part of our campus identity, which I think leads to those questions about how do we build this into the curriculum. I know that SLU is working to make a unit on SLU and slavery part of the core curriculum that every student learns about. And at Georgetown, there's a problem of God class, I think it's what it's called, where students are beginning to grapple with some of those moral questions about what does it mean for the Catholic Church to hold people in slavery? How did they justify that? How did enslaved people shape the Catholic faith? How do we reconcile with these tensions that we see? There are groups of high schools in the United States, Jesuit high schools, that are working on developing curriculum. There's actually a curriculum workshop happening in mid-October where groups of Jesuit high school teachers are going to be learning this history and learning from all kinds of experts in the field about the history of slavery in general and within the Catholic Church, and how to build curricula that tell these histories and also bring in Catholic teaching and Ignatian spirituality to help students consider what we ought to be doing in the present with this history.
Yeah. Do you think there's any effort or momentum around payments to descendant families?
So was it January? I think in January of this year, descendants of what's known as the Georgetown University 272, GU 272, announced with the Jesuits the formation of the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation, where I'm trying to remember the monetary amount, but millions of dollars were pledged to begin doing work on racial reconciliation in the United States and to support descendant communities in elderly care and education. So that agreement's already been made, and descendants and Jesuits are moving forward on that front. But the vast majority of people descended from people enslaved to the Jesuits in other parts of the country haven't been part of that conversation. So I'll be curious to see how this evolves as more descendant communities come to the table.
Right. I think we need to basically come close to wrapping up here. I may want to just sneak in one last question from my colleague Leo Guardado, who asks about the presence of the imitation of Christ in your research on slavery and religious institutions. Was this a document that shows up a lot? Records? Is this something you see? I know it's a document and Leo knows it's a document the Jesuits take up very seriously, or took up very seriously. Do you see that a lot in enslaved communities or in records about them?
This is the only reference where I see it. So I don't know whether that makes Peter Hawkins unique or whether this was common among enslaved people, but it's notable that he in particular is noted for knowing this work really well. And skimming through the Imitation of Christ, I noticed in many ways it emphasizes humility and obedience. And that's the way Peter Hawkins is described in that passage. And I wonder if there's any correlation to why he's being associated with that. Yeah.
And as a last, thank you for that. As a last word, can you talk about your future plans for publication? Somebody's asking, where are you going to put out more of this information and this research?
Sure. I have an article, Slavery and the Shaping of Catholic Missouri, coming out in the Missouri Historical Review for its bicentennial issue this year. And I'm working on turning my dissertation into a book. And I'm hopeful this is all very new, so bear with me, but I'd like to try to make that book either open access or as affordable as possible so it can be accessed by more people. So if you want to see this work reach the public, when I reach that stage, I'd love to get support from all of you in doing that.
Yeah, so I'm sure you'll have a lot of people signing up for that role out of our crowd here. And on behalf of everybody and Professor Lee, I'd like to just thank you so much again for taking the time to be here and provide us with a detailed walkthrough of this really incredible research that you've accomplished with diligence, integrity, and so much creativity and care. So we are all benefit from that. And we'll continue to look to your research and be eagerly awaiting these new publications and see a lot from you in the future, hopefully here at Fordham in the near term and not too long from now. So thank you again, and good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thanks for
Bye-bye.
having me.